Welcome to MusicaNova Backstage, a behind-the-scenes conversation with artists in MusicaNova Orchestra's upcoming concerts. I'm Michael DeBerry, and today we're joined by two musicians, one from Boston and the other local. Rhonda Ryder is a world-class cello soloist with a prolific career as a chamber musician and pedagogue who is dedicated to the performance of new music. She will be premiering a cello concerto by Rina Esmail with the MusicaNova Orchestra on January 25th at 6 p.m. at the Musical Instrument Museum here in Phoenix. And Stephanie Sadovnik is an opera singer and stage director who serves as a faculty associate in voice at Arizona State University's School of Music, Dance, and Theater. Stephanie is the artistic director and co-founder of the Arizona Women's Collaborative, a group that has premiered 30 new works across different artistic disciplines in annual showcases since its inception in 2017. Today's conversation is not only a chance for us to learn more about Rhonda's approach to new music, but also an opportunity for us and Stephanie to gain insight into some best practices for collaborating with composers and advocating for new music beyond the concert hall. Rhonda Ryder and Stephanie Sadovnik, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
So I want to begin the conversation Rhonda, by asking you about what has it been like in preparation for the upcoming MusicaNova Orchestra concert? What has it been like to prepare these two very different pieces? I mentioned one, the cello concerto by Rina Esmail, but maybe you could tell us about there's two actually, and they're very different. What has that been like?
Yeah, it's been a great adventure. I love Rina Esmail's music, and she's writing Western classical music, but inspired by Hindustani music. And so the wonderful part of learning this is that you have to be able to be very flexible with how you approach cello playing and how you approach the music. I've been doing a lot of listening to Hindustani music and a lot of listening to string players who play that kind of music, and it's incredibly complex. So I'm not pretending to be actually playing the music, but music, Western classical music inspired by Hindustani music, which is it's a fascinating sound world. And she does such a beautiful job at just creating this gorgeous landscape. It's exceptional. And the other piece by Victoria Yagling, I had never heard of this cellist composer. I'm very sorry to say. She won the Casado competition. She won silver in the Tchaikovsky competition. She was a formidable cellist and a wonderful composer. Elizabeth Longo McKinnon is the one who found this, and she's in the cello section of the orchestra. What's been fascinating for me is that I'm learning the piece from her score and from her part, and it has her fingerings and bowings in it, which fingerings are a pretty personal thing. You know, everyone's hands work a little differently. And so I feel like on some level, I know her really, really well because I know how her hands work, and not all her fingerings work for me, but you get an insight into what she was going for, what different colors she wanted, what strings she wanted you to be playing on, if she wanted, a darker color, a brighter color. It's been fascinating. I'm very sorry I never had a chance to meet her.
Connecting with fingerings and bowings directly from the composer, how common is that you get to have that type of insight into the way a musician was thinking about the exact intentions of what sort of color or what sort of bowing physicality they were looking for? Is that something that living composers that you get to collaborate with, do they specify that when they talk to you about, I want this and use only 6/8 of an inch of this or that?
I don't think they're quite that specific. I mean, in this case, it's unusual to have fingerings in the part because unless the piece is being written by, for example, by a cellist, then you really wouldn't have the opportunity to know exactly how they played something. But composers are very specific about the sounds they want. And that's part of the collaborative aspect, which is so fantastic, is working with a composer. And I find especially if a composer doesn't really write for the instrument, doesn't know like the specific instrument very well, that you really have to get into what kind of sound you want. Then let me figure out how to make that sound on the cello as close to, what you're hearing in your head when you're writing the music.
And that makes me think also, Stephanie, I am thinking about how in conversations with you, you've talked about through Arizona Women's Collaborative that there's a lot of freedom with these new composers because there's not a lot of recordings of things before. So you get to feel a little more open to making decisions. Has that been, I actually want to ask that to both of you. Is there a weight lifted off your shoulder to be able to play new music and not have 70 recordings of the Emperor Piano Concerto? Why don't we start with Rhonda, and then I would like to hear from Stephanie.
It's fascinating working with composers. One thing that I like the most is that everyone's sound world is different. Every composer is asking for a different thing. Every piece requires a different, something different from the performer. I've had wonderful conversations with composers. For example, the composer Raven Chacon, he at one point wanted a solo cello piece. He wanted the sound of time moving backwards. We had to spend a lot of time trying different sounds and finally came up with something which I think works really well. But that sort of abstract idea is just fascinating. Then another composer, Jan Swafford, he's a musicologist, wonderful musicologist, also a composer. He wrote a piece that's inspired by the Grand Canyon. And so he wanted the sound of a canyon wren, the exact sound that a canyon wren makes, which is tough on the cello, but very fun. And then he wanted a sound of a flock of birds. And so I worked on it and I played a few things from that I thought were really great. And he's like, no, no, too many birds, fewer birds. Funny conversations like this and the sound of pebbles dropping. It's not always as specific as that. But it's very, very fun working with a composer and just trying to figure out what is the sound that you're getting after.
Wow, I love the idea of I would like you to make the sound of time flowing backwards. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. Um, and I also appreciate that was it Jan Swafford, you said, requested a flock of birds, but not too many. I
Right.
think that that's a great indication. Stephanie, how about you? What has your experience been like as you're working one-on-one with these artists and not only composers, right?
Yeah, so in the AWC, we bring all creatives together, and sometimes we have people who want to try composing and they haven't done that before. Or one of the selling points I try to tell people is that they get to be part of the process, the creative process from the very beginning. And that's so rare. And maybe coming from a singing background, and I think any instrumentalist also feels this way. A lot of times you're handed the piece that you're told to play when you're in school. And then when you're going through your professional life, you get hired for a gig and you're handed the piece to play. And that's wonderful. And you're a vessel and you interpret. And it's like that's a wonderful job and responsibility to hold. But when you get that chance to be part of that creative process, um, it can be really changing for a lot of people about how they can view their own instrument, I think, and how flexible. I think you were talking about that, Rhonda, about how you need to be more flexible with your instrument and to tell I think, I don't know if telling the story is the right words that I want to use, but telling the stories of that haven't been told before sometimes and in a different way. Um, and you just allow the creativity to be a little bit more flowing and free. And so I think it allows students, especially who are in that time, 'cause that's who I work with primarily, of course, in this organization, who are in such a rigid part of their learning process, it feels sometimes, because they're trying to perfect their instrument and their craft. It allows them a lot of freedom and a lot of fun. And I think sometimes they forget that it's allowed to be fun when you're playing and singing. So it's really gratifying to watch students, especially when it comes to the voice, let themselves be very free with their voice and experimental with their voice, because there's so often in the Western classical tradition, you're taught one way of using the voice. And it is really amazing to see them expand that for themselves. Um, and to also be able to do something beyond just singing, to be able to write some poetry, to bring a visual component to it, a dance component to it, um, try something that they've never tried in performance. And it's always nerve-wracking and a little experimental, but it's really always interesting to see what bubbles to the top. That was very windy and long, so sorry about that.
That was great, actually. And you know what two things I was thinking of. One is that, doing new music where you have to look at a score and you really have to question everything. It really informs how you look at, for example, a Beethoven sonata. And I'm looking at
Yeah.
the score going, wait, what did he actually mean by that? And, the importance of having an text edition or looking at the manuscript is really
Hmm.
fascinating. And the other thing about the freedom, isn't it essential? I remember when I was a student at Oberlin, I had a bunch of friends who were composers, and we thought it was so cool. We would go into a practice room at night and we would turn the lights really dark and we would improvise. And I'm sure it sounds just terrible, but there was something about that freedom that you
Hmm.
have to make a certain sound. It didn't have to necessarily be a beautiful sound. It could just be anything, and there were no rules. And so it
Yeah.
frees up. You discover something, and you discover, oh wow, I can make this cool sound that I might actually make in a piece of music at some point.
Yeah. And you never know when you're going to be asked to do something um, that you've never done before on stage, and you really do have to like figure out how can I make my voice do that, and you really have to let go of you have to let go of all of your preconceived notions a little bit. You have to let go of your self-judgment too. And that is so freeing for these students who can like let go because they don't really let themselves do that.
I think that is the perfect place to ask Rhonda, would you talk a little bit about your journey in advocating for new music and becoming someone who plays so much new music? I assume that it was a process, although it sounds like you were already ready to let go at Oberlin. What what was the I love also the detail of it's not only that you did these very avant-garde improvisations, but they were at night and there was a mystique about it. Would you talk a little bit about the process of becoming the artist that you are, and what was it like to find new ways of doing things, to let go of that type of judgment, and how did it start?
That's such an interesting question. I think because I've played new music, really since I was in college. Um, I don't tend to look at it differently from older music, but so after my graduate school studies, I joined the Lydian Quartet at Brandeis University, and part of our job was playing pieces by very talented graduate composers. So we were always playing new music. And we continued to program it along with, this is a long time ago, but along the lines of doing something like a Mozart or a Haydn quartet, a contemporary work, and then finishing the program with something like a Brahms or something, and because we were playing for concert series that really did not want a completely new music performance. Occasionally we would get that, but not usually. Usually it was pretty mainstream. But it's been fascinating. When the quartet won the Naumburg Award, we were given the opportunity to commission a composer, and we commissioned Lee Hyla, who I didn't know at the time. Our first violinist had heard her work at Tanglewood and really thought it was something special. And that started a relationship that lasted until his untimely death, but about 40 years of working with this person. And it was fascinating. We both felt that we influenced each other's, I influenced his compositions, he influenced my performing for sure. And there's a certain amount of trust that you build with a composer you've known for a long time. I would receive scores from him, and my initial response would be, "This is unplayable." And I learned to just quiet that and sit with the music for a few weeks because it indeed was playable. He knew what he was writing. But also, I did work with him on some sounds that he wanted that he wasn't quite sure, or, it's very hard to write a piece completely without actually hearing it and seeing, okay, is the volume level right? Is it expressing what I want? Is it often composers will write things they think they must be faster, and then you actually try to play it with their metronome markings, and you find that, oh my goodness, that's like music, but faster than music. So it's a fascinating experience to work with a composer over a number of years. John Harbison is another composer who I've worked with for a very long time. Um, and what I'm enjoying right now is working with young composers. My next project, which I won't talk too much about because it's not finalized, but would be to commission a bunch of composers in their 20s and 30s and just see, what their voice is like, because it's vastly different from older, more established composers.
Rhonda, would you expand on that last bit about what is it that an older generation of composers is the worldview different? Is the do the uh, are the older composers just in need of another cup of tea? They're a little, they. I mean, I'm always tired, so I'm sure they're tired too. And these young people, they're still going into practice rooms late at night and making new crazy impossible things happen. Is so what do you see as what how would you put into words uh uh the difference between the young composers and the maybe are they more established or they're more um, kind of officially connected to a certain school that sets the older generation apart? I'm not sure.
I don't know that there's a way to generalize about it, because every composer's voice is so different and they're inspired by such different things. The beauty about composition is that you can write, well, if you're Elliott Carter, well into your hundreds, it's just, you can write your entire life. It's amazing. And so I think um, that part is wonderful. For younger composers, I just find it fascinating to see what they're inspired by, because when you think about it, there's never been a time in history when composers had such access to all different kinds of musics. The fact that I'm playing this piece that's being inspired by Hindustani music is just amazing to me, that I get the opportunity to try to go into that world. And just hearing what people find attractive, and where they feel their heart is. It's just, I find young composers fascinating in that regard.
Do you feel along those lines, if I could piggyback on that question, do you feel like the soundscape of maybe the older generation or the more experienced generation to the newer generation is vastly changed because they have so many different influences. And um, I mean, I, for one, feel like electronic music is just, at least here at ASU with the students that I work with, is everywhere. And people are really um, doing quite a lot with live electronic music and um, changing making sure like in the performance that the performance is different every time because they're working on the live playing alongside of the electronics, etc. I don't know all the words because I'm not a composer, but do you find like the soundscapes themselves are vastly different, or just because everyone's different?
I think really everyone's different. I mean, if you look back at like the 60s and you've got Pauline Oliveros and you've got, all of these people doing fabulous, inventive, crazy stuff. Terry Riley, just a whole bunch of composers doing things. Then some composers became then more conservative, which is very interesting. And now I feel like you get everything. I mean, I know young composers who write very beautiful tonal music, which, I would think is pretty old fashioned. It sounds new when they write it, but it's a certain old fashioned medium. Um, and then there are other people who are just extremely uh, writing maybe what might be called noise music, or something which has a lot of texture to it and doesn't have a melodic line. But, so I think you can just find anything. What I what I like to do with my students, all of whom play some new music, um, I give them a whole bunch of things to listen to, and I say, I have no idea what's going to appeal to you. So you listen to these and come back to me with your thoughts, and then we'll take it from there and assign you something contemporary that you really love. Because it's vast right now. It can be almost very confusing.
And now I really want to ask, could you give us an off-the-cuff mini playlist recommendation as if we, the audience, were your students and you wanted us to listen to maybe four very different things, just as a little gift, please.
Okay. It might be a little bit string centric, so I apologize for that. But I think there are a number of pieces by Lee Hyla, and his name is spelled Hyla. One of them is Lives of the Saints, which is for a singer and like a Pierrot ensemble. It's fabulous work. Another is called Howl, and that's a setting of Ian Ginsberg reading his poem Howl and the Kronos Quartet, playing the quartet part. Um, Another piece is Dream of Innocent the Third, which was inspired by the Giotto painting of that name. It's for amplified cello, percussion, and piano. Then I would say, oh, there's so much to choose from. Um, if if people haven't heard like basically electronic music or recorded music, I would say Different Trains would be a good piece by Steve Reich. That's a very interesting. It's for live string quartet, and on top of that, three recorded string quartets, and it's recorded by the Kronos. I would say listen to it live. I don't think on recording it does it quite justice because you really need to hear the recorded sound and then the live sound. Um, you know, I think music by Elliott Carter would be also sort of an interesting thing to listen to. Um, John Harbison has a beautiful work with a really interesting instrumentation. It's soprano, two cellos, and two pianos called Different Worlds. And that's fascinating. Um, I'm leaving out a million things, I'm just sure. I think, anything by Rena Esmail would be very fun to listen to. Um, I also, I mean, there are a lot of younger composers who I really love. Laurie San Martin, who's out at UC Davis. writes beautiful, beautiful music. Also, Ian Gottlieb, who's down in LA, writes great cello music, and it's uh, a bit experimental. I mean, I could go on forever.
And we appreciate that. That's pretty awesome. Thank you for that little gift. Um, I wonder, Stephanie, if you wanted to jump in, or if I have a question about, you mentioned Elliot Carter. Um, Stephanie, do you have a preference to jump in, or should I ask away?
Well, go right ahead and ask about Elliot Carter because I'm always fascinated by
Okay.
him. But I do have a question about teaching because as a teacher myself and introducing new works and new composers alongside of that balance of maybe the canon, like what's considered canon. And then yeah, I have a lot of other questions too, but go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
you know what? My question about Elliot Carter is related a little bit more to uh, that article he once wrote, the Who Cares If You Listen? And so I think that's a question about um, new music and relationships with audiences. So let's start actually, Stephanie, with the question about teaching and working with students, and later on we'll shift towards thoughts about audiences. So go right ahead, Stephanie.
Just to reiterate what I said, Rhonda, just working with students who might be hesitant to work on new works. Obviously, you give them a wonderful list to start with and what catches their ear. Um, and then I guess like balancing the repertoire for them. We work with students at all different levels, I'm sure, at all different skill sets. Yeah, I was just wondering your approach to that. I'm sure it's student to student, but if there are general things you look out for the student to let you know that they're ready to take a step into a little bit more experimental territory and into a bit of an unknown pathway for them.
Yeah, something comes to mind, and I'm sure you do this as well, but it's really fun to work with them on a piece of new music and then go back to their Brahms sonata and saying, okay, so in Brahms, we've got these hairpins, and so what they actually can mean time taking, which we're not going to do in a contemporary piece unless the composer specifies it. Just looking at things and comparing them and seeing what they can glean from looking at a contemporary piece. It's really it varies on the person, of course, but I think right from the beginning, getting people used to the idea that there's new music out there. At Boston Conservatory, we have a wonderful program where we pair composers with students, with instrumentalists. And so cellists will have pieces that are written for them. They'll work with a composer. And I think the first thing which they have to learn is that the composer doesn't necessarily know how to play the cello. So don't feel you have to play everything they wrote. Because if it's not playable, or if it's going to take you 30 hours of practicing and the piece is never going to be played after that one performance because of that, then you can talk to them and suggest different things. So you have the agency to actually influence the piece of music. And that I think is really invaluable. It gives you such permission to also feel that way about other pieces.
I love that. And I know from my experience, sometimes just using contemporary works with singing, we have the added element of words and poetry. And I find a lot of students get hung up on old German poetry. Like what was Goethe saying here? For them to take a piece that's more contemporary with poetry that's more on where they are and and speaks to them where they are and uses language that they're familiar with, not just their home language, but just poetic language, you know?
Yeah.
And then going back and seeing how looking at even just a Shakespeare piece and deciphering the language now that they're a little less skittish about poetry in general. But that's great. That's great advice. And the idea of letting students have agency over what they're singing is, I think, the big lesson, right? Of new music, old music, all music, to let the students have agency and teaching them how they can create that for themselves by looking at the score or working with a composer. You're exactly right. Being able to have a voice in that process, right?
I wanted to jump in and tie some things together because um, I was starting to see, Rhonda, the similarities between your story about looking at hairpins and Brahms and thinking, well, what if hairpins can be rubato? And also your story of talking about that in Rina Esmail's music, there's a very strong Hindustani classical tradition influence. And so what I'm seeing from those two things is that we're talking about different styles, different, as if they were lenses or different windows that color an entire perspective in a different way. So if you're looking at a piece of new music, you get to think, or as you said, you go back to your not new music piece and then you look at it in another way. But then looking at new music, we might take our classical lens and say, oh, I see some slurs. Maybe I know what to do with these slurs in a classical way. Or I see those hairpins. Maybe I'm going to think about a Brahmsian way. And that makes me think that for new music, there's almost an infinite number of lenses that could be applied. And that's very intimidating, especially if, in the case of Rina Esmail's music with Hindustani music, that has the Hindustani influences, that's something we're not taught at Western European Classical Conservatory. How do you how do you guide a student, or how did you approach the idea of taking on this new style? You said that you listened, but you did a lot of listening, and you're still doing a lot of listening as you do this. As if you have a student working on something like this, do you send them off to some master classes with a Hindustani player? What do they really need to do to take on something like that? Because it seems like taking on another lifetime almost, just to see this new lens.
What's nice about Esmail's music is that it is Western classical music. It's influenced by Hindustani music, but we're not. Um, it would take as much practice as we do on Western music to learn Hindustani music, if not more, because it's incredibly complex. And so what I'm trying to do is create a slightly different sound world. So there are some very specific things in the music. There are slides and there are ornaments, which if there's an ornament in Bach that we're bringing out that note. That's, so we're being very clear. If I heard a student playing it, I would want them to be very clear with the articulation and with the turns and, not so in Hindustani music. It's a little bit, they're almost suppressed. They're still there. The turns, the slides, everything is still there, but it's much more subtle. And just trying to be able to do that is the tricky part. But I think, if people can study other musics, I think that's a fabulous thing. I think it just whatever area you want to go into, go for it. But yeah, it takes a lot of work on it, and I think probably the way I play it in the concert in Phoenix, I probably will play it differently in 2 years. Maybe better. I'm hopefully better. We work with what we have at the moment. I don't know if that answers your question, but
It does. Oh, I think it speaks to the idea, a beautiful idea, that we're living, changing people, and the music is living and changing, and we will have a different experience in the future. I think hopefully everyone has the same sort of memory of a beloved English teacher that said to them once, "King Lear is not the same in, at age 15 as it is at age 25, as it is age 35." And uh, surely that speaks to one of the reasons that as classical musicians we keep playing old music. But then it also speaks to some incredible things about what will these new pieces be like, heard by audiences later on, or even heard and played by yourself multiple times. So, in other words, audiences, you should all go to these shows, even if you've already seen the piece again, because it's a different piece,
It's
different
true.
people, different times.
It's true.
I'll get off my soapbox. Maybe that's a moment for me to transition to audiences since I just mentioned them. They're always there, lurking, or we hope they are, and but we care very much about what they think because we do it to connect with people. Um, and I want to bring up the idea from Elliot Carter, who you mentioned as someone that students should give a listen to. Um, will audience members, you can let us know what you think of Elliot Carter when you get to go listen to him, because chances are it's very different than things that you've heard in the past. And he famously wrote, and there's context for this that we can't get into here, but he famously wrote an article called "Who Cares If You Listen?" And it's a very particular avant-garde informed, institutionalized informed idea from the, I want to say, 1970s era. And that was a while ago, and we don't necessarily always think the same things nowadays. But it begs the question, how has your relationship, Rhonda, been in in reaching audiences where they are, even as new music is going in extraordinary new directions? How do you bridge that gap between music that an audience member is expecting to be pleased in a certain way? I can hear my older relatives using the word melodious to describe different pieces when I would practice at home, and then tell me that that Prokofiev concerto sounds like it has, quote unquote, they said, no melody, they said. I had some thoughts for them, but please tell us, as you communicate the the sort of sometimes thorniness and not always welcoming nature, how do you welcome audiences into the new music world?
There are several organizations and concert series that are doing this really beautifully that I think would be worth looking at. You need to create trust, your audience, between the audience and the performer. And that if you're playing something, it's because you have a strong feeling about it. And so if the audience trusts you, then they might want to hear their Schubert, but they also might trust that, wow, there's something that might be kind of cool about this piece as well. So there's a group, boy, there's so many of these that I put in the chat, but there's a group called Chatter Albuquerque, Chatter ABQ. They have a fascinating series. The concerts are on the weekends, and they're 10:30 in the morning. One of the concerts on Saturday, I think, is in Santa Fe, and on Sunday, it's in Albuquerque. They also have a late night concert, which is a Friday night at 9, about once a month. But they play 50 weeks out of the year, and they are completely sold out. They're completely filled. The programs are, you could go and you could hear a Beethoven piano trio, then you could hear something by Rena Esmail or someone else, something contemporary. There's also a poet in the concert who reads some of their poetry, and there's 2 minutes of silence. The concerts are only an hour long. They serve coffee in the back, so you can get your latte and sit at a table in the back, or you can sit up where the seats are set up more like a standard audience, where you're closer to the stage. And people come every weekend. And I mean, it's not a format that would work everywhere, but it works so beautifully for them. To be playing 50 weeks out of a year is amazing to me. It's something, that it might be worth looking at their website to see what they're doing. It's fascinating.
Absolutely. And it sounds also, as you talked about creating audience trust, it sounds that having a format that the audience knows is going to be repeated, they expect the 1 hour, they expect the 2 minutes of silence, and they may expect a latte. And that that means that, and they maybe expect poetry, so they have this certain feeling that, oh, these people, and they get to know them over time. I appreciate that. Stephanie, do you have a question to jump in with? Because I'm still thinking about lattes and 2 minutes of silence.
Well, I love the idea. I'm curious about the 2 minutes of silence and where it occurs in the program, if it's before or after, so that people can, one, welcome themselves and their bodies and their minds into the space, and or in the at the end, being able to let themselves sit in that moment, right? And let it kind of like shavasana, like let it settle in the body so that you can take it with you out the door. Um, that's fascinating, and I absolutely love to hear that there's organizations that are doing so well. On that note, I had I wanted to ask about New Works organizations. Ours is really just very school based at the moment, and um, I don't know if it'll get bigger or anything like that. But um, has there anything that you've seen as far as these organizations? It seems that you were talking about wherever you are, knowing who your audience is, and um, it's not just about programming, but it's about understanding the needs of the people who come to your audience, right? Or come to your concert, right? So
Mhm.
obviously, for using Chatter ABQ as an example, they found that Saturday, like in the mornings, was a place and a time where people, one, had the time, had the energy, and were wanted to have that wanted to have that, I don't know the word I'm trying to lose, I'm so sorry. Um, Stimulation is not the right word, but they wanted to have that jolt, to start their day off, which I think is really so different from when you usually hear music, right? Which is in the evenings sometimes. Um, but I just wanted to ask if there was anything that you saw for successful or arts organizations in general terms, like what set them apart, what sets them apart, as opposed to those that kind of can't quite find their footing and have a difficulty connecting with their audience, let's say.
Yeah. There are several things I can think of. So recently I started it's a week-long summer chamber music festival with a good friend of mine, and it takes place in Harvard, Massachusetts, not to be confused with the university. It's a place where the transcendentalists lived, and there's also was a Shaker community there. So these students come, they're very select chamber groups. There are only about 6 of them. They actually live with host families. They're fed by the community. People take turns cooking, and the community comes and listens to their rehearsals and their coachings. So they're really embedded in the community. They play at the general store. At the end of the week, they're playing in a concert hall, but which is actually the Unitarian Church. But they're really embedded in the community. And this is a group of people who are just exceptional in Harvard. But when we first started it, one of them said, "Now, what's an open rehearsal?" There was no preconceived idea of what was going to happen. But I think it's working within your community. There's another thing I've done for decades now, which is I hold a cello seminar in upstate New York on a farm. It's rural New York State. And we live together. There are usually about 8 or 9 cellists. And there's a wonderful pianist, Judith Gordon from Albuquerque, and some other wonderful cello faculty, David Russell and Scott Kluckstall. And we all work on only contemporary music. And some of it's solo music, some of it's with piano, and some of it is cello ensemble music. And at the end of the week, we give a concert in a 19th century vaudeville hall in Cambridge, New York. And the audience over the years has just evolved. And it is people who go to the concert, not because they know anything on it, but just because it's the cellist playing again on that Sunday in June. And so we're going to go see what they're about. And one of the things that is very important is that the students who are playing the works, they need to talk about it. They need to talk about what they're playing. And they need to talk about it in a way that is not going to be like their master's degree orals. This is going to be like, tell me what you like about it, and don't use any terminology that might scare people or that they're not familiar with. We want to be very inclusive and not in any way alienate someone because they don't use the same terminology we do. Just it's fascinating. There are other places like Apple Hill, which is a chamber music festival in New Hampshire. It's a summer festival. They bring together people from all ages and all abilities, and they put them in chamber groups, matching their ability and their levels. But what they've added is what they're calling playing for peace. It's the home of the Apple Hill String Quartet, and they go around the world playing in all sorts of places. But they bring together people. For example, there was one group a few years ago which had someone from Turkey and someone from Syria, and they were learning how to play chamber music together. It's fascinating. I mean, it's really hard to hate somebody when you're playing in a chamber group with them. It just and you find all the commonality, and you're working really hard towards one goal, and it's that kind of thing I think is just amazing. Um, Palaver Strings, they've just been nominated for a Grammy, which I'm so happy about. A bunch of former students. They're a string unconducted string orchestra, basically. They're a small string orchestra. And they play also solo pieces. They saw a need for music up in Portland, Maine. And so they started a school, basically. And they do early childhood programs, they do string instrument lessons, they do concerts, they travel around. They have on their website an anti-racism statement and a climate statement. And it really, it's fascinating. Who would have thought of putting that on their website years ago? It just would not have happened. This is more like it's not really a concert series, but it's Shelter Music Boston, which I think is a little bit like Street Symphony in LA. But Shelter Music is chamber musicians who get together and play in homeless shelters. And unfortunately, in the Boston area, there are a number of shelters. And you might be playing in a place where women are learning to do interviews for jobs, or you might be playing in a shelter where you can be using the ideas just to get people off the street. One of the places I've played with them, there would often be an ambulance that would, drive in because someone had overdosed, or there would be police presence, and shelters are just really, they're rough. They can be rough places. And I've had a number of people say after hearing a concert, wow, I'm going to actually be able to sleep tonight, which I haven't been able to. Or one woman said listening to a Mozart string trio made her feel like she felt when she was high. And so she was going to put it on her phone and listen to it all the time. Things like that. And this is what I found most interesting was the woman who started Shelter Music is Julie Levin. and she asked me if I would play a piece by Raven Chacon, it's a solo cello piece. It's very, um, it's not noise music, but it doesn't have a melodic line. I don't think your relatives would be that happy listening to it, but it's very evocative. It's crazy and beautiful stuff. It has time traveling backwards, and the people who were listening to it had real thoughts about it. And when you think of it, going into a situation like that, and people who, if you see someone who's unhoused on the street, chances are you're not going to talk to them. You don't you don't know if they have a mental illness. You don't know if they're going to be dangerous. You don't know, anything about them. And so these people are ignored. But here they are faced with musicians who are saying, I want to know what you think of that piece. I want to hear what you have to say about it. And it's such a wonderful way of presenting music. It's something that we all need music, and I think it's also really wonderful for students to get out of a situation where they're being graded. And whether it's
Yes.
retirement community or a hospital or yeah.
That's fascinating, Rhonda. And I think it's obviously lots of different ways that we can cater to the audience in a way that's not just kowtowing to the audience, right? But being able to really be of service. And I don't know if I'm sure you feel this way. I don't want to speak for you, but in as musicians, that's part of our job is to be of service to the community. And um, I think organizations like these and hopefully all most arts organizations have that as their backbone to be of service to their community. And that's again a fabulous list of places to search out to seek. um, I have family in Boston, so I will let them know of all these wonderful opportunities to seek out some music outside of the larger arts organizations that are wonderful, but these little kind of hidden pockets where you can really find some magic. Yeah.
I wanted to make sure that um, the people that you talk to know about the fact that our national parks have artist residencies. I've been in residence
Yes.
in Grand Canyon and at Petrified Forest, and
Yes.
you have to have a project. You have to apply for it. I did it on a whim. I called up the person who was in charge of Grand Canyon and said, I have an idea. I want a bunch of composer friends to write pieces for me inspired by some aspect of the canyon. Should I even apply or should I just like not do this? And she said, well, the last performer they had was called the Cowboy Crooner, and he sang and did rope tricks. And I did see him. He's very good. But I thought, oh, yeah, no, this is not. But I applied and I got it. And it was fabulous. So you live
Yeah.
in the park and you play or sing in the park in various places. It's, whenever you feel like doing something. It's really,
Yeah.
really wonderful. And I think people are very open to sitting down and listening to 5 minutes of music when they're looking at,
Hmm.
the landscape and just they're very accepting of whether it's new music or old music.
We have so many national parks out here in the Southwest, and there's so much natural beauty that I think it's something for MusicaNova and like-minded organizations to be really interested in, is that it's not only here, but all around the state, all around the Southwest. Rhonda, I just wanted to say again something that you said that really stuck with me. You were talking about the power of what music can do for people when we play for them, and you said that music can give people a sense of dignity. It can give them a sense of peace. It can give them a sense of direction, especially with the woman who was so inspired to, I'm going to put that Mozart trio on my playlist because I want to find that feeling, and I'm going to make my life go in that way to find that feeling. And then what I wrote down also, I just need to say it again because you said it so poignantly, that I want to hear what you have to say about it as what we would say as the performer to the audience member. And maybe just like dignity, peace, and direction, that is another need that people have, all people, that we want to be asked. The audience wants to be asked about how they got to interact with this piece and what it meant to them. They want to tell their stories. And it makes me think that maybe a very important part of new music, connecting with people, is the conversation and the space to have the conversation. It's not, it doesn't need to be, and definitely shouldn't be, like the coronation of a canon Mozart symphony, and then everyone has to clap because this is the work of art that everyone said. You know, we get to talk about it afterwards, and maybe that's another human need, that for people to be asked, what did you think about this, and did you get to enjoy it? Do you include that sort of moment in new music collaborations and performances where the audience gets to come up with you? I bet they're dying to talk to you.
Well, I do that with the cello seminar. We have a time at the end of the concert. We say, you know, if you'd like to stay and talk to the musicians, we'll be milling around, you know, and people can come up and have a, you know, one-to-one conversation about it. But I think it's also very interesting to have that conversation as sort of part of the concert. Have, you know, just like 10 minutes on, you know, what did you think of that piece? You know, or do you have any questions about it? It's a fascinating thing.
Could you expand on that? Do you mean like an intermission, or do you mean from the stage? And because many times the audience is physically pushed away from the performers, they're in the dark, they can't even see where their things are if they needed to get up. How do you make that conversation happen in the middle of a performance?
It usually, when I've done it, it's needed to be set up ahead of time so people know that you're going to play a piece of music, and then afterwards there's going to be 5 minutes where you have the opportunity to ask a question, or, you know, or if there's no questions, that's fine. But the lights are brought up, you know, so that people can see. Occasionally there's a microphone if it seems like a hall where it's hard to hear, but it's better if it's a smaller space. And people have the opportunity to ask, you know, someone like, what does the score look like? I mean, that's a frequent question, is what is it, what's what you're playing? How do they notate what you're doing? And how do you make that sound? You know, I think it's fascinating what people come up with, what questions they have about what we spend, you know, so much time doing.
That sounds like an idea for all of our organizations to look forward to, and a real joy to get to give audiences. I think we're at a great place to sort of wrap things up. Were there final thoughts, Stephanie, that you wanted to ask? Were there things, Rhonda, that you just we need to get there before we say goodbye?
I think we've really covered a lot. It's been great talking with both of you, and I think I look forward to being in Phoenix and, you know, seeing what the music scene is like there.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much. This was fascinating and very inspiring for me. And I can't wait to just let this percolate a little bit. And I'm excited for your visit here, and I hope you enjoy Phoenix.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for this conversation. There's been some real gems that came through this, some playlists, some organizations we can be very excited about, and also your concert that's coming up on January 25th at 6 p.m. at the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix. You can find more information at musicanovaz.org. And yeah, I can't wait to see you in person at that concert and to be involved with lots of conversations about what did we think about what we heard. So thank you again, Rhonda, and thank you, Stephanie, and thanks for joining us. Can't wait to see the performance.